Hi there, my name's Tom, back talking about F1 Fantasy. We've come out of Baku, we're going into Singapore. This video is all about what's happened in Baku, what's going to happen in Singapore, what are the talking points, what's the team selection. Let's just get straight into it. First things first is my team coming out of Baku scored 282 points, which I'm not trying to brag here, but it was actually one of the best scores out there that I've seen. I know there's a few people that have touched the 300 point mark, which is fantastic, but it is almost like as good as you can get. And I will admit that I got a bit lucky in terms of the Mercedes outperforming what they probably should have done because of what happened on that kind of second to last lap with Sainz crashing into Perez. That obviously boosted up a lot of drivers. Boosted up both the Williams to further points, basically boosted up everyone who was behind. The only person that didn't really benefit was Piastri and Leclerc. Although, admittedly, maybe it helped Leclerc because Sainz and Perez potentially would have overtaken him on that sort of final lap-ish to go. I think it was quite possible that Leclerc would have been overtaken because his tyres were shot to pieces. So anyway, lots of big ramifications coming out of the Sainz-Perez crash. But for me, I kind of got away unscathed. No horrible disasters. The only real kind of disaster, I guess you want to call it, is the final fix. But it wasn't even a disaster because I switched it to Piastri because I felt like he had a good chance of winning the race. I was tempted by Hamilton, taking a punt on Hamilton from the back, but I ended up going with Piastri because I was like, well, I've already got Leclerc, and if I have Piastri as well, they're probably the best bets to win the race. So if I just move to Piastri, I've kind of got that the race winner most likely locked up, and it did pay off that way. Great, it worked how I wanted it to, except the fact that Lando Norris had an absolute storming race from back in P15. Again, also helped by the fact that Sainz and Perez crashed out, boosted him up P4. Fastest lap is just ridiculous. Lando Norris is, in fact, off F1 Fantasy Tools right here. I've got it here. Fastest lap. You can see he's really trying here. This is just showing up the fastest laps. The last three fastest laps in a row have gone to Lando Norris. I think he's really trying for it. He's trying to scrape every point he can out of the barrel. Admittedly, he only had one fastest lap until that point, but he is now on a roll of 3 in a row, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it again in Singapore. He's trying to scrape every point out the barrel, and that point for him is worth 10 points for us, and a lot of us will be 2 times on him, so it's 20 points. So again, kind of more evidence to suggest that we need Lando Norris in our teams, and to 2 times him most likely going forward. Anyway, apart from that, the Mercedes did well. Again, exceeded expectation because of the Sainz-Perez crash. That Perez-Sainz crash had such big ramifications, and if you're one of the people that were unlucky enough to be on the kind of receiving end of that, if you own the Ferrari asset, I know a lot of people do, and in fact, the only reason I don't own the Ferrari asset because I haven't found time of the transfers to actually get them in. I haven't had the budget, etc. I've wanted Ferrari for the last couple of weeks, but I've just sat with Mercedes because I feel like they're quite safe and comfortable, and there's not too much difference between them and the Ferrari. But admittedly, the Ferraris were technically the right choice going into Baku. And like I say, the Sainz Perez crash just kind of changed everything. They kind of swung the points around. Mercedes still would have scored fine, but that got boosted up quite considerably by the fact that Sainz crashed out, bringing down the score for the Ferrari constructor. The Williams boys did well. Joe actually did well for the first time in a long time. Let's move on to discussion here that I've got brought up just for some general kind of points of interest to discuss. As I was going to touch a minute ago, if you are one of those unlucky sort of Sainz Ferrari owners, don't beat yourself up over it. It's not worth it. It's just pure unluckiness. You ultimately, the decision to put Ferrari, Sainz, Perez, whoever you went for in that instance, was, in my opinion, basically the right decision. It just got unlucky towards the last couple of laps, and you really can't afford to beat yourself up over it. Try and stay positive. You made the right decision once you've set that decision in stone by confirming come the deadline or locking in your final fix, whatever you've done. That decision is out of your control, so just try not to feel too bad about it. But if you do feel bad, lay a comment down in the video here and I'll try and make you feel a bit better. Anyway, let's have a think about what we've learned. Already touched on the fact that the final fix chip was wasted for many. Like I say, I wasted it by moving it from Lando to Oscar. I mean, it was the best case scenario, the best of the worst case scenario for me, moving it to Oscar. At least Oscar won the race and scored well. A lot of people moving to Charles Leclerc. I would have moved into Charles Leclerc if I didn't already have Charles Leclerc, but I did have Charles Leclerc, so I moved it to Piastri, like I say, to cover off that kind of race winner. And ultimately, I think a lot of people were burnt by the fact that they moved it from Norris to the likes of Charles Leclerc, who, again, still came second. It was fine, but it's still nothing compared to Lando Norris, absolute machine that continues to chug away at those fastest laps, positions gained in this instance, and just a really quick McLaren. Interestingly now, Piastri and Leclerc are both now A-tier assets, and I don't think that changes things dramatically for me. I think as the season kind of draws to a close, the final sort of group of races to come, I think that it's less important to build budget. It's still nice to build budget, particularly when you can get like a nice chunk of it. But now the assets that are sub 25 million, the likes of Carlos Sainz, Hamilton, Russell, etc., they're less likely to get that million rise. The likely race winners at the moment are basically, in my opinion, Norris, Leclerc, Piastri. Maybe Verstappen, probably not in Singapore though. Maybe Sainz if he has a good race like he did here last year. Obviously won in Singapore last season. But anyway, in terms of building budget versus points, right now I'm much more focused on points. And if I think the likes of Leclerc and Piastri, for example, are the best optimal drivers for that given weekend, then I'm not going to give it too much of a second thought thinking, oh, they're A tier, I don't really want them in my team. I just want to make sure I get those points. Now as the business end of the season, all the budget we've been accruing hopefully through the season is now going to hopefully pay dividends. And yes, it's nice to still grow the budget if you can, but I'm not going to be super focused on it. Like early on in the season when I was going into the sprint weekend, back in around Miami, China period of time, it was a big debate. Oh, do we go budget? Do we go for the points? Back then, I can fully understand a lot of people went kind of the budget route, but right now, the business end of the season, budget's going to mean nothing in a few races' time when the curtain falls on the season, and I want to try and focus on the points personally. That's just my opinion. I don't know, maybe you're different. You still want to grow budget with B tier assets. That's absolutely fine. But yeah, it's just interesting to note that both Piastri and Leclerc are both now in the A tier. Piastri himself is scoring really well. As you can see, his scores in the last few races, 46, 30, 20, 29, 47. He's consistently getting those big double-digit hauls, basically. He's starting to win races now. He's not really getting the fastest laps. He's only had one fastest lap all season, but he's still a contender for potential driver of the day, as we just saw in Baku. Although I do think Lando Norris is also still in contention for driver of the day. He had that period of 6 out of 7 races in a row. That makes sense. A group of 7 races, he had 6 driver of the days in a row, and since then he's only had 1. So I think Lando Norris is still getting quite a big percentage of votes. He's just not necessarily winning it because the likes of Piastri have had a phenomenal race in Baku, or Charles Leclerc had a phenomenal race in Monza. Those sort of outstanding performances are rightly putting them ahead of Lando Norris. But I do think that Lando Norris is definitely going to get at least another 1 or 2 driver of the days before the end of the season. But nevertheless, Piastri is still a fantastic asset, and he's only like about $1.5 million cheaper than Lando now. And like I just said, he's in the A tier, but I do still think that Oscar Piastri is still a great option. He's just so consistent. However, obviously, we have got the whole driver championship, Lando Norris being favoured potentially by McLaren. So I do think if it was in a vacuum and I had to choose between them for budget reasons or whatever else, I think I'd still be kind of locking in Lando Norris over Piastri, despite Piastri's great performances. Basically, yeah, because McLaren have suggested they might favour him in a race. So if it's a 1-2 Piastri lead, we may well see Piastri just step aside and Lando Norris go through for the win. We also see Lando Norris keep getting these fastest laps. There's just lots of reasons why Lando Norris is a great 2-times driver. And like I say, if I had to pick between the two at the moment, I'd say Lando Norris for those reasons, but Piastri is certainly excelling. Other things to chat about before we move on to the actual team selection this week. Red Bull struggles are real. Yeah, we've seen it. We've seen this news article come out about how it's all started back in Barcelona back in 2023, and it was just sort of plastered over by the fact that Max Verstappen was just driving so well, and they went in the wrong direction of their development, etc. But the struggles are genuine, and we can see that the likes of Ferrari and McLaren are kind of overtaken the Red Bulls, or have overtaken the Red Bulls in the pecking order, and the Red Bulls are not cited to bring the next upgrade of theirs until COTA. So we got Singapore next, and then COTA comes after that. So we could see a Red Bull revival in the race after Singapore, but for Singapore itself, where they struggled immensely last year as well, I'm probably, unless they somehow do amazing for the practice sessions, and I don't really see myself touching the Red Bull asset until at least COTA. It will be really interesting to see what happens in COTA, because it is a sprint weekend. We only get FP1 plus sprint quali before the deadline, so it'll be interesting to see what happens going in there as to what we want. for our teams, and it would be nice to have 3 transfers open for fiddling about and wedging in potential that Max Verstappen. If Red Bull come with an upgrade in Kota and we want to get Max Verstappen in there, we may well need that 3 free transfers. So just bear that in mind when you're sort of thinking about your transfers. This week I managed to just do the 1 transfer going into Baku, so I've got that luxury kind of 3 transfers at the moment, and I'm going to try, if I can, when I move on to team selection, kind of keep that open as well, because I do think Red Bull are definitely struggling, but there could be a bit of a turnaround come Kota, so we'll just kind of keep ourselves open to that. Aside from that, the Williams back in the mix. They really are excelling, and earlier on the season, having the likes of Albon and Sargent in our teams was just pretty massively detrimental. They were leaking budget, they were not scoring points, they were DNFing. It was just pretty miserable, and it was really like you put Sargent in your team and you're just praying that there's no DNF basically. And admittedly, he didn't get anywhere near as many DNFs as last season, but he's now been replaced, obviously, as we all know, by Franco Colapinto, and he's had a phenomenal couple of races, really phenomenal for his first sort of attempt at F1. And it's really been a breath of fresh air seeing him in there, seeing what he can really do, and taking the challenge to Albon in a way as well, particularly out qualifying him in the last race. So yeah, the Williams have just had that great revival since their upgrades, and apparently there's another upgrade coming in Singapore from what I've seen through the grapevine, on the Twitter grapevine, if that's even a thing. But yeah, I've seen a few things suggesting that Williams are bringing an upgrade to Singapore. Correct me if I'm wrong, or agree with me if I'm right. But yeah, I think there is another upgrade. So having double Williams in our teams is absolutely nothing bad at the moment. Really interesting to see. Then it's good to see as well. I'm quite pleased for them. They've certainly gone through their struggles. And speaking of struggles, the Saubers and their pit stops at the beginning of the season is just a quick one for me. Just want to highlight that the Saubers got the fastest pit stop, and admittedly it was only about 2.3 seconds, which isn't lightning fast from what we've seen earlier on in the season from other teams. But they still got the fastest pit stop of the weekend. And earlier on in the season, they just struggled so hard on that, literally in the pits for 30 seconds or whatever the hell it was. So to see them come back, again, kind of highlights kind of Red Bull's fall from grace there, and indeed even Ferraris. They've just really not been up there. These kind of lesser constructors are really up their game in the pit stops, and we can't bank on those points for the likes of Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes, etc. It's all like the Alpines, the RBs, and now the Saubers are getting in on the mix as well. So it's really interesting to see, and I'm quite pleased for the Saubers. And the final thing I want to discuss briefly here is just Behrman. He had a good race, and if anyone was unfortunate enough to bring him in, they somehow lost 1.7 million. And I know there's this thing going on about, it's the 0.5 gain from Magnussen's previous price. But if that's actually the case, then all that says to me is, in the future, if you're ever going to bring in a driver who's standing in for one race, like we've just seen with Behrman, like we saw earlier on in the season, Saudi Arabia for Behrman, if we're going to see when they leave, their price get adjusted that dramatically, I don't know if this will happen again next year. Maybe the developers will have a better way of implementing it, but it's just something to be aware of if this ever comes along again. That losing 1.7 million is pretty huge, to be honest. That's pretty huge, considering he technically did enough for a 0.5 price gain, even though it's 50 million, so it wouldn't have actually been 0.5. But it's all a bit weird and a bit messed up. I don't know really what the developers have done. I don't know if they know what they've done themselves. It's a bit weird, and it's hugely punishing if you did go with Behrman. Luckily, he was only owned by 1%, so I doubt anyone really went for him. But it's just an interesting kind of note. Avoid all costs basically for the future if you have someone standing in who's kind of higher priced than who they're standing in for, if that makes sense. Let's have a look at team selection. So this is my team coming off the back of Baku, and we're going into Singapore, where my first thoughts, this is early on in the week, we haven't really had much going on, obviously haven't had the practice session, so my thoughts will be tweaked and cemented come that time. But right now, early thoughts are that Ferrari are really quite the real deal, and yes, obviously didn't score so well in Baku because of the big Sainz crash, but I do still think that Ferrari's going to be strong here. Obviously Sainz won around Singapore last year out, and I've been itching to kind of shift the Mercedes for a while now, and I think now might be the right time. What I can do for my team personally is make quite an easy switch. I can't unfortunately just do one transfer and get them in. I'm 0.4 short of that, so I can either drop someone like Albon, who I don't want to do because I'd have to drop Albon down to a Bottas, and I know Bottas is obviously going to be experienced around Singapore, and that's kind of what you want because it is a tricky track to drive. But that is one way I can get the Ferrari constructor in alongside Leclerc, and that could also enable me to double up or triple up even rather with the McLarens. I can use all three of my transfers to get them in. Like I say, I don't really like dropping Albon down to Bottas, but if it means I can squeeze in the likes of Piastri, who's a high potential race winner, the Ferraris, who are at the moment kind of second best constructor. I really like this team. It's really simple. I mean, it is a bit annoying that it uses all three of my transfers. I wanted that flexibility going into Kota, but if I just want to maximise the best teams, I think this is probably the best way to do it. If I wanted to save that third transfer, I could resist bringing in Piastri and hold of Leclerc if the Ferraris continue to look good in the practice sessions. One other option I could do to again kind of hold my transfers is to what I could do is just use two transfers, bring in Ferraris and someone like Hamilton or Sainz in this area, so I can still kind of double up on the Ferraris. I am kind of tempted by the Hamilton pick as well, just because it kind of nicely and neatly uses up my budget 0.0 left in the bank. But also Hamilton's also, I know I've already touched on budget not being so important so far, but I do think it's still worth bearing the thought about, is that Hamilton's a B tier asset and he's likely to become an A tier asset after Singapore, barring a DNF or a bad race where he goes up like 0.1 or whatever. He's obviously got a very good record around Singapore, like he does around most tracks, to be fair, but he's scoring well. He's not like winning races at the moment. He's not being quite as on a high as pre summer break, but now I am still tempted to have him in there because also we've got Kota around the corner, and if Mercedes are also cited to be bringing a new floor to Kota, so we could see again a further upgrade to Mercedes. We know how good Lewis Hamilton is around Kota as well, so two solid tracks for Hamilton. Like I've already said, he's great pretty much everywhere, but he does particularly excel around certain tracks. I think it's 4 victories around Singapore. I want to say, I might be wrong. Apologies if I'm wrong, but I think it's 4, as well as 9 victories, whatever it is around Kota, whatever it is, whatever the numbers are. He's phenomenal around the next couple of tracks, and yeah, it's a bit of a punt going with him in this build, but it does open me up, like I say, to a bit more of a budget gain. And also the fact that I'm almost certainly going to be 2 times in Lando Norris, the fact I'm not putting the 2 times on Lewis Hamilton means I can pretty much afford to potentially take that punt if Hamilton scores, say, 20 points, and the alternative to him is Piastri and he scores like 30 points, and so be it, I've lost 10 points, but it's not the end of the world. I've got that flexibility going into Kota. Whereas if I want to get Piastri in, I'm going to have to shuffle around an extra transfer, which is kind of annoying. Of course, I could also just leave the Mercedes in, but I do feel early on that I definitely want Ferrari. So all I've done here is basically swap out Ferrari asset in Leclerc, bring in Hamilton, swap out the Mercedes assets for Ferrari. So kind of done a big flip basically and use up all the budget. So I do like this team. I think Hamilton is definitely a cheeky option, but also if I don't want to take any sort of gamble on that, I think Carlos Sainz is equally a very good option. He's just had that little price fall as well, so he can enable you to upgrade elsewhere. For example, Albon might go up to a Hulkenberg or whatever, but I personally would actually probably just hold on to Albon, particularly as they're driving so well at the moment. So yeah, I'm quite open to being flexible, but I think primary thought is to bring in the Ferraris, pair them with the McLarens. Lando Norris is going to remain my 2-time, and then this kind of slot, it's almost, I don't want to call it a luxury slot, but I guess it kind of almost is. I don't really want to faff around touching the budget guys, moving them around. I want to save that transfer if I can. So if I don't want to have to faff around bringing in Leclerc and Piastri, I'd be quite happy to take a bit of a punt. Whoever looks the best out of these guys. Like I say, Hamilton's in my mind because of Kota coming up, although it does give me a slight flashback to what happened last year where I put the 2 times on him and he got disqualified, but we'll brush over that. But yeah, I do think this is kind of where my mind is at the moment. It's quite narrow-minded. Normally I'm like, I could do this team, I could do this team, I could do this team. But right now I am pretty set on doing either this build where I have a Hamilton or a Sainz most likely, or I use all 3 transfers. I'll cut off Alex Albon down to a Bottas and go with this team with a little bit of money left in the bank, but so be it. 2 A-tier drivers here, not going to get much budget, but again, so be it. Like I said, I'm more interested in the points. One other thing to note as well, if I go with this team, because both Piastri and Norris are highly likely to do well, we've also got Singapore, dangerous, tricky street circuit. We've got rain forecast. could be a great opportunity to use the autopilot. I used the autopilot here last year to good effect. I'm trying to think of who was in my team last year. I had like Alonso, Norris, Sainz, and someone else. I can't remember exactly, but either way, Sainz, pulled through. I think I had Verstappen. I think I had Verstappen as the other driver. Um, Budgets were very different back then, and so were the driver prices. But anyway, yeah, my point is that autopilot is definitely on my mind this weekend. I would love to save it for something like Brazil, where I can try and maximise the ceiling on a potential 2 times driver around a sprint weekend. But using it as a safety belt instead around a wet Singapore track, where Piastri and Norris are neck and neck a lot of the time. I think it's certainly on my mind to fire off the autopilot. Potentially, when I say safety belt, I mean use it as a safety measure to avoid any potential disasters. If either Piastri or Norris DNF, then at least my 2 times, will move to the other driver that doesn't DNF. And if both DNF, then it'll move to someone like Colapinto, and so be it. But at least I won't get the double DNF points. So yeah, autopilot definitely on my mind. And the only other chip I've got left is the 3 times, which I'm thinking about using in Kota, but again, I may well save it for down the line for like a Brazil or Qatar. But I think at the moment I'm kind of leaning towards Kota, but we'll worry about that in a few weeks' time. Right now, the only chip available to me personally is autopilot. Could use no negative if you've got it. I don't have it, but I personally think autopilot is potentially a good opportunity here, particularly if we're going with a team like this, the likes of Piastri or Leclerc and Norris, that sort of combination, where it's not entirely clear who necessarily is going to win the race, who's going to be the top scoring driver, and as well as being a dangerous track, as well as being wet, autopilot certainly has a great appeal to me this weekend. So we'll see if we fire that off as we get closer to the deadline. I think that kind of sums up my thoughts, to be honest. I haven't got, team selection is fairly straightforward. I kind of want to get the Ferraris in and basically either triple up on the McLarens, which seems probably most sensible, or I could take a bit of a punt on like a Hamilton or a Sainz. And that's kind of where I'm at going into the weekend. Obviously, we'll see the practice sessions come Friday, Saturday. Probably going to be wet. Probably won't learn anything, and so be it. But we'll go with the flow. Thanks very much for listening to me for yet another team selection video, and I'll catch you in a few days' time for some more thoughts. So yeah, thanks very much, and catch you soon. Bye for now.